Thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing and my lab has been doing over the past 5 to 10 years, actually. So let's start. First, I'm going to just give a brief introduction of our lab. So I'm from the Reinforcement Learning and AI Lab at University of Alberta. It was founded by Rich Sutton a long time ago in 2003. And I'm also from University of Alberta, which has a long history for AI and games. So for instance, some of the work that UFA has done is checkers was first solved by Jonathan Schaffer at University of Alberta. And we have a group which works on imperfect information games, which was the first group to make an AI which can beat professional poker players in a limited setting. And we also did some early work on the game of Go. And David Silver, who went to make AlphaGo later in his life, did his PhD at UFA working on the game of Go. The Atari arcade learning environment was also proposed at UFA by Mark Belmar, and that is one of the most commonly used benchmark in deep reinforcement learning nowadays. And about me, I've been at the lab for about 3 years. I work with Martha White and Rich Sutton. Over the past 2 years, I've been working on meta learning and representational learning for online learning. And now I've shifted to working on agent state construction for reinforcement learning. So that's about us. And let me just give you a brief roadmap for the talk. So my talk, I'm going to divide it into 2 parts. The first part is just the motivation behind some of the work that we're doing. So as usual, you will see that the kind of research what we are doing is trying to satisfy some constraints. And these are very hard constraints that a lot of the community in AI doesn't care about. So I'm going to explain why we care about these constraints and why we think it's important to satisfy them. And then in second part, I'm going to just talk about 3 ideas which can allow us to do scalable real-time learning for agent state construction. So let's start with the first part, the motivation. So the big picture is that we're interested in building agents that can learn autonomously in large and ever-changing world. And here I really want to emphasize that on large and ever-changing. And I'm going to argue that there are 2 things that agents have to do to successfully achieve this. One is that they have to learn in real time. And the second is that the learning algorithm they use have to scale well as the agents get larger and the problem gets larger. So what do I mean by real time? Imagine you have an agent which is interacting with the word. For example, maybe it's make predictions about the word. And as it makes predictions, it gets some feedback from the word. Now, this feedback can be as a result of prediction error, or it can be supervisory signal from some experts or some other feedback. Now, the agent has 3 options. It can either ignore this feedback, it can store this feedback and delay learning, or it can use this feedback to incorporate in its behavior immediately. And I'm going to argue that ignoring it is the worst thing you can do. If you store it and delay learning, that's pretty good. But if you learn in real time, that's the best thing you can do if you want to achieve goals in large world. So there are 2 reasons for that. One reason, which is very obvious, and I already mentioned, is that the world is non-stationary, which means if you ignore feedback, well, you can never do good because the environment is going to change in unpredictable ways. These changes can be very subtle, like your seasons change over time, or these changes can be more large. For instance, when we were born, we were not used to using touchscreen phones, and now we can use them without any problems. The changes can also be in the agent. So if you have a robot, you can imagine that the friction between its actuator might increase over time. And this is definitely true for humans. When we learn to walk, we are 2 feet tall, and then we grow to be much taller, and our walking policy still works. And finally, these changes can be due to the fact that we live in a world with other agents. And because the other agents are always learning continually, that means that we have to adapt to incorporate their learning. And there is a second reason why we need to do real-time learning, and this is a bit more subtle, and that is the word is much larger than the agent. So even though I drew this picture first, the actual picture looks something like this, where the agent is very small. And what that means is that the agent cannot learn everything about the word simultaneously. It doesn't have the capacity to learn everything. So let me demonstrate this with a very simple toy example. Imagine you have a 2D grid word, and you want to make predictions in every state of this word. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing a color gradient, which represents the prediction error. So if you are trying to learn a fixed solution and the word is too large and the agent cannot represent the optimal solution, then arguably the best thing the agent can do is learn to make predictions everywhere with some level of accuracy, but the error wouldn't be zero because it doesn't have the capacity. Now, if a learner is learning online, it can do something smarter, which is it can do tracking. So depending on where the agent is, it can use its capacity to do well on that part of the state space at the expense of the state space that is further in time. And when agent goes to the other part of the state space, well, it can repurpose its capacity to now do well on the other part of the state space and forget about what it learned in the past. Now, there is an analogy I can give to explain this more clearly, which is the exam analogy. So imagine that instead of taking the exams that we usually do, whereas we have a course, we study for it, we give the exam, and then we study the next course, that I give you 2 years, you can study as much as you want. And then on one day, I will test you on every single course on chemistry, physics, and all the things you can learn. Now, intuitively, you would say that your performance would probably be much worse that way, as opposed to if you had to learn for one thing, give an exam, learn for the second thing, give an exam. And that is exactly what tracking is. That as you, if you can anticipate where you're going, you can learn about that part of the state space better at the expense of other temporally distant part. Now, this can also be demonstrated empirically. So there is a very nice paper which was published in 2007 in which they showed this on the game of Go, but I'm going to show it on a much simpler environment. So imagine your grid word is 500 by 500, and then your state is simply the coordinates at that point. And your targets are just generated using a random neural network. And your goal is to learn these targets for this whole state space. And your policy is a random walk. Now, I'm going to plot the average mean squared error on this complete problem on all the states as a function of the size of the agent. So if you're trying to learn a fixed solution, which means you're trying to learn to minimize error on all states simultaneously, then when your function approximator is very small, which means your agent is very small, the error is very high. As the networks get larger, the error goes down significantly. And that's what you would expect. Now, if you compare this to an online tracking agent, which is simply learning using online stochastic gradient descent, then the error bar graph looks very different. Now, when the neural network is very large, the fixed solution is a lot better. But when it's very small and has limited capacity, then the online tracking agent can do much better because it's only trying to predict what's around it. Now, I would argue that most of the benchmarks and a lot of the research in machine learning is focused on this, the right-hand side, where you have enough capacity because your problem is small enough so you can learn an offline solution and do well. But many of the real world problems we care about are on the opposite spectrum of this edge, where we continually have to adapt to current part of the word to do well. So that's online tracking. Now let's look at the pros and cons of these three strategies, which is if you ignore the feedback or you delay learning or you're learning real time. So if you ignore feedback, then what are the benefits? The primary benefit you get is, well, it's very simple to implement. You train an agent, you deploy it, and you're happy. You don't have to change it ever. And then some people argue that if you're interacting in the real world, it's also safe to not learn online. Now I have a question mark there because I don't agree with that, primarily because if the word is changing, then arguably it's actually safer to not ignore the feedback, because ignoring feedback means, imagine your agent is doing something that is bad, it's making a mistake, or it's doing something that you don't want it to do. It is going to continue to make that mistake forever. Whereas if the agent was learning online, it can adapt and change its behavior and stop making that mistake. Now, the disadvantages of ignoring feedbacks are very obvious. If the word is non-stationary, you can't do well. And then you also cannot do tracking that I explained in the previous slide. If you delay learning, now this is pretty good, I would say. If you delay learning, then you can adapt to most changes in the environment because most of the changes in the environment are very slow. So imagine that you're going to deploy an agent and you're going to continue to collect data. And every 2 days, you're going to update the model and then redeploy the update model. So Now you're also doing continual learning. And this is what most production systems in the world look like right now. But this also has some disadvantages. So one is that if you're interacting with the world using very high resolution sensors, then you would have to store a lot of data. This is a problem that you can fix by just getting more storage. But there is another more subtle problem, which is that your learning algorithm has no control over the data collection policy. And that is an issue because imagine you're learning in the world and you're making some mistakes. If you're making some mistakes, you're already in the part of the state space where you're making those mistakes. And you're in the best possible position to collect more data around that state space to fix your errors. But because you're going to delay learning, which means you're not going to use this error feedback to change your behavior, that would prevent you from doing that. Now, an example of this can be if you're playing, let's say, a video game, and you are used to pressing a certain button for jumping, and this video game requires you to press some different button for jumping. Now, if your algorithm is fixed, it's not adapting in real time, well, then you'll continue to press the wrong button, at least when your policy is fixed. Then 2 days later, you will look at your data that you collected, and then you will realize that that wrong button was not working. And then when you play that game again after with the updated model, you might try pressing some other button. But that 2-day delay is bad because when you were pressing the wrong button in the first place, you were already in the optimal place to learn and change your behavior. And that's something you can do with real-time learning. So if you're trying to learn real time, you get the same benefit as continual learning, and you can adapt to non-stationary words. But then now your learning algorithm can also control how to collect the data. Now, the primary disadvantage of real-time learning is, well, it suffers from this problem of catastrophic interference. And catastrophic interference is essentially a phenomena in which if you're trying to learn end-to-end using deep neural network, and you update your network using stochastic samples, then your update interfere with the knowledge that you had learned in the past. And a consequence of this is that your algorithm might not end up learning anything, even over a very long period of time. Now, all three approaches have pros and cons. Why is the real-time learning approach better? Well, there's a primary difference between the cons of real-time learning compared to the other two approaches. In the other two approaches, the disadvantages are fundamental limitations of the method. So there is nothing you can do to let your learning algorithm influence the data collecting policy if you're going to delay learning. It's just not possible. Whereas in the real-time learning, the main disadvantage is a problem which is in your solution method. So if you can come up with better algorithms, that issue is fixable. So these are the three reasons why we, or I at least, want to work in real-time learning. Now, the second important component for achieving goals in large and ever-changing world is that your learning has to be scalable. Now, why is scalable learning important? Well, let me first just define what I mean by scalable learning. So the idea of scalable learning is that the amount of memory and operations you need for inference should be comparable to the amount of memory and operations you need for learning. And both of them should scale linearly with the number of parameters in your model. Now, as I will explain later, this does not hold in most of the algorithms that we use. So why is this important? Why do we care about scalability? Well, I already mentioned that the word is large, which means we want to use very large models to operate in this world. And this is something which is corroborated by empirical evidence. So there is a lot of evidence now, or there's a lot of recent work which shows that on large problems, as you scale your function approximator, your performance improves dramatically. So two examples of this in the supervised and unsupervised learning community are GPT-3. So they show that if you're trying to learn language models, as you increase the size of your model, your performance increased significantly. And then there is also this self-supervised learning in the computer vision community, in which they show that if you increase your model, your performance improves significantly. Now, there is a third indirect evidence which shows that we need large models, and that is that animals have very large brains. And this could be due to many reasons, but one can argue that it must be beneficial for them to have these large brains, even though they're very power hungry. So let me give you an example of how large are the brains of animals. So these are 3 different algorithms, DQN, GPT-2, and GPT-3. And GPT-3 has about 100 billion parameters. Now, if you look at animals, even very simple animals like a honeybee has synapses which are comparable to GPT-2. Now, I'm making an assumption that synapse is equivalent to a parameter, but if we make that assumption, that's pretty surprising because honeybee is not something that we associate with intelligence. And then when you go to more sophisticated animals, their brains are extremely large. Now, the research community is trying to make our models large as well, but there is one difference between how the animals and humans learn and how our models learn. And the difference is the amount of compute they use and the amount of energy they use. So a human brain, which is an order of magnitude larger than the largest model we have ever trained, uses about 20 watt of energy to operate. GPT-3 on the other end uses a few million watt of energy. And part of the difference is because our hardware is not as efficient, but the primary difference is that the learning algorithm that these algorithms use are not scalable. So for example, GPT-3 uses a batch size of 1 million, which means that it's using 1 million times more compute for learning compared to inference. Similarly, if you look at deep reinforcement learning algorithms, for example, OpenAI 5 or AlphaStar, they also use very large batch sizes, about 1 million or 100,000 for learning, which again means that they're using significantly more resources for learning than they are using for their inference. Now, if you could come up with algorithms that do not require a lot of resources for learning, the amount of resources you need for learning are comparable to the amount of resources you need for inference, well, then you can scale learning to large function approximator and neural network while still keeping the system, making sure the system doesn't require a lot of resources to learn. And this is especially important for online learning. So if I go back to these algorithms like GPT-3, well, their goal is to learn a fixed network and then never train it again. And if that's your goal, then it's fine to use a lot of compute and find the best possible parameters you can. But if your word is non-stationary, then you have to learn continually all the time, which means that if you have an agent, a large agent, and you use an expensive algorithm, then it always has to be connected to a very large data center for learning, which is simply not feasible. So this was the brief summary of the motivation of why we care about real-time learning and also why we care about learning to scale. Now, the second part of the talk is about a few ideas that we are using to scale learning on real robots. And the goal here is to build an agent state. So let me just explain what we mean by an agent state. And an agent state corresponds to if your agent is interacting with the word and it's seeing data from its sensors. Well, you want to create some features or some representation from that data such that that representation allows you to learn things very quickly. Okay, so let's talk about the architecture. So I'm not going to talk about these ideas in very detail. I'm just going to explain them at a very high level, but I think that should be fine. So the first question we have to answer is, what should be the source of supervision for learning these agent states? Well, one option is you could do supervised learning, but if you rely on an expert, that doesn't scale. And not only is it not scalable, there is a bigger problem that for a lot of systems, you don't have experts. So for example, if you want to train a robot that has 8 legs to walk, well, you don't have an expert for that. The second thing you could do is you could use the reward function to learn. Now, the reward function ideally should only encode the actual goal of your system. So for example, if your system is trying to play Go, it should give you a reward when you win the game. It shouldn't give you a reward anytime in between. And that's because if you give reward at arbitrary time, which doesn't represent your goal, your agents, and that actually happens in real experiments, agents learn to exploit that reward signal. So if you're only going to use a reward signal to encode the actual goal, then the reward signal is going to be highly sparse for most of the problems that we care about. So even though it's a good source of supervision to figure out what our goal is, in the short term, it can be very sparse and it doesn't allow you to learn very quickly. So the third option is you can do some sort of self-supervision. And self-supervision is an idea which has been popularized again in the recent years, but it's something that reinforcement learning people have been working on over the past 15 years, I would say. Now, in the community, people do three different kinds of self-supervision. So I'm just going to categorize them. What a lot of people in computer vision do is they try to predict a transformed version of your input observation. So you're getting an image and usually a sample IID from a data set, you're going to transform that image using a function. You might rotate it or you might extract small patches out of it and then shuffle those patches. And then you try to predict the original image or some other signal from the original image. Now, this approach is, the one problem with that approach is that you're not really predicting anything real about the word. The function, the auxiliary function you define, for example, if you want to predict the rotated version of the image, well, essentially you are learning an auxiliary function and nothing about from the real world. The training signal is not grounded in the real world. And people do this because if you're learning from IID samples, well, this is the best you can do. But if you're interacting with the world, then you can do better forms of self-supervision. So one idea is you could do one-step predictions. So you're in a state, you take an action, you can predict what would happen when you take this action, and then you can optimize, improve that prediction. And that's much better than the first option because now at least you're getting signal from the real world. But there's something even better we can do. The better thing we can do is we can make multi-step predictions contingent on a policy. So we can predict, for instance, that if I'm standing near a wall and if I walk straight, then in 4 steps, I will hit the wall. And similarly, you can make hundreds and thousands of other predictions about your sensory stream. Now, these kind of predictions are significantly more powerful than the second kind. And there's old work that has shown that you can represent your knowledge. If you can represent your knowledge in this way, you can learn things very quickly. So let me give you an example of all the 3 kind of predictions just to make it a bit more concrete. If you're trying to do self-supervision and you want to use the first kind of self-supervision, well, you will, and your state is simply the position of your agent, ij, well, you might predict the output of some function f, where f is often hand designed. If you're trying to do option 2, well, then you might predict what would be your state if you take the action up. And in this case, the state would be I and then j plus 1. If you're using the option 3, then you can predict something more interesting, which is, let's say, how many steps do you have to take before you hit the wall? Now, one problem with learning predictions, which are contingent on policies, is that your target would be delayed. So imagine, let's look at this example again, and imagine we want to learn the third kind of predictions. Then as agent moves up, your prediction initially at t equal 1 would be j, and then it will be j minus 1 because that's the number of steps you need to hit the wall, and so on. But you have no idea what j is before you hit the wall, right? And as a result, your target is delayed in time. So at time step t, the agent has no idea how far away it's from the wall. And then at time step j, it finally hits the wall and it knows that at time step 1, it was j steps away from the wall. But because the target is delayed, that means it's not obvious how you would learn these predictions in a scalable way. So one naive thing you could do is you could store the inputs from the whole trajectory. And then once you get the target, you can compute the target and then update your prediction. But the problem with that is the longer your horizon is, the more things you have to store, which means your algorithm is no longer scalable, which is one of our main goals. So here, there is an interesting idea which was proposed in 1980s in its first form, and then it was expanded in the last decade by Hado and Harm, which is that there are certain type of predictions that we can learn independent of span. And here independent of span mean that in the old picture, our span was j because our target was delayed by j steps. So can be learned independent of span if larger, the computational and memory requirements your algorithm need stay constant. So what they showed was that if you're, for instance, trying to predict something constant, well, then you can do it in a constant amount of time. So then instead of predicting j minus 1, j minus 2 at every time step, imagine you predict just j at every time step. And then you can do it in a scalable way. The problem is now the prediction is no longer interesting, and it's not even representing the thing we want to represent. We want to represent the distance from the wall. Now it's just incorrect. They also showed that if you're trying to predict something which is a discounted sum of a scalar, then you can learn that prediction in a scalable way as well. So imagine that your robot has a bump sensor which has a value of 1 when the robot hits the wall, and it's 0 when it's away from the wall. Then what you could learn is you could learn a discounted sum of this bump sensor value in the future. Essentially, you're going to learn a value function, but instead of trying to learn the discounted sum of reward, you're going to learn the discounted sum of one sensor value. And your prediction might look something like this. At time step 1, when the agent is very far from the wall, the discounted sum is very small because future is discounted. As you go closer to the wall, your prediction rises. And then when you're about to hit the wall, the prediction is very high. And if you look at this graph, it is essentially encoding the distance to the wall indirectly. We're not predicting the number of steps required to hit the wall, but we are learning how far the wall is in an indirect way. And this is something that you can learn using constant number of compute per time step, irrespective of how far the wall is. Now, they use this idea, Adam White and Joseph, who were two profs at University of UFA, and Joseph is a research scientist at DeepMind Edmonton. They use this idea to show on a real robot that we can learn a lot of predictions in a scalable way. So what they did was they had a robot which was interacting with the world, and they had a single stream of data, and they hand designed thousands of predictions, and the goal was to learn all of them simultaneously. And how did they hand design these predictions? Essentially, they were predicting the discounted sum of every input feature. So if your robot has, let's say, 65,000 sensors, or how many sensors it has, you're going to predict the discounted sum of every input value that you're getting. So I'm just going to show one graph from their paper in which they had something similar to a bump sensor, and they were trying to learn something like the distance from wall. And here the black dots, dotted line, represent the ideal prediction that is the true discounted sum of the sensor. And the red value is the learned prediction. And as you can see, the robot did learn to anticipate these things by just interacting with the world. Now, the interesting thing about this work was that they learned thousands of predictions in parallel on a single laptop, multi-core laptop in 2014, which means it was a fairly slow laptop compared to modern standards. And if you use modern GPUs, well, you can actually learn millions of predictions, if not billions, simultaneously using this method. And this really shows that if your algorithm is scalable, then you can do this kind of parallel learning that you cannot do if you use non-scalable algorithms. Now, they also showed that you can learn to anticipate a bunch of other things. For instance, if there is more light on one corner of the room, well, the robot knows that if it turns towards that corner, the light sensor would increase. And in addition, they also showed that you can learn control policies on top of it, using it similarly by just single stream of data. For instance, you can learn, the robot can learn that a policy to maximize the value of the light sensor, which happens when it turns towards the light. Now, this was all very cool, but the approach had a few limitations. Well, one was that they assumed that the state of the world is given to them. Whereas in real world, well, we have partial observability in most cases. And secondly, they hand designed what to predict. So I would say there was not a lot of hand designing because their approach was, let's just predict everything. But we do need a method so that the agent can come up with its own questions and figure out predicting what thing would be helpful for maximizing the reward. Now, the work that I've been doing is targeted towards answering this first question, which is how do we come up with methods which do not require that the state is given to us, and they can allow us to operate in partial observability while still staying equally scalable. And this is something that we recently finished, and it's still some ongoing work. And the idea was to come up with algorithms that allow us to do real-time scalable recurrent learning. So let me just remind everyone what a traditional recurrent network looks like. Well, you have a recurrent network, you take an input, a hidden state, you process it, you get the next hidden state, and then you take the input from the next time step, and so on. And then you make a prediction using your hidden state, which has information from multiple time steps. And usually to update your recurrent network, you have to compute the gradient of your error or your output with respect to your parameters at all time steps. So I'm just going to write the gradient for the output with respect to parameters in the first time step. So you can compute this gradient by simply using chain rule, in which you first compute the gradient of the output with respect to hidden state at time step n, and then hidden state n with respect to hidden state n-1, and so on and so forth. And then at the end, you compute the gradient of the hidden state 1 with respect to theta 1. Now, there are two ways you can compute this gradient. You can do it starting from n and going back, or you could do it starting from time step 1 and going towards n. And because multiplication is associative, it will give you the same answer. And even though it gives you the same answer, depending on which side you start from, the algorithm is very different. So one is called backpropagation through time, and the other is called real-time recurrent learning. And these are their characteristics. So if you use BPTT, well, then one problem is that you have to store past activations. And as your time horizon increases, you have to store in more and more activations, which means that the algorithm doesn't scale well in terms of memory. A bigger problem is that you cannot compute the gradient in real time. So you have to first make the predictions, and then you wait, and you would do all this computation while the agent is waiting, and then you would make the update. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, because you have to store the activations, your memory requirement depend on the span of the prediction. Now, RTRL looks much better if you look from these criteria. You don't have to store anything from the past, and that's because now you're computing the gradient in the direction of time, so you can compute it as you're interacting with the word. The gradient computation is also is spread uniformly. You're computing it at every time step, and then finally, the memory requirement is independent of the span. So even if you want to compute gradients for very long trajectories, the amount of memory you need is the same as you would use to compute the gradient for very short trajectories. Looks all good, but there is one big issue that even though the memory requirement is constant, it's still very high. And in fact, RTRL is intractable for even moderately sized recurrent network. And that's primarily because of the dimensions of your matrices for your gradient computation. So if you look at the RTRL gradient computation, it has to store a Jacobian, which is essentially the gradient of the hidden state at time step k with respect to all the parameters. And the size of this Jacobian is the number of parameters you have times the number of hidden states you have. And additionally, the number of operations you have to do at every time step is equal to the number of parameters times the number of hidden states squared. And that number is extremely large for a recurrent network with 1,000 states. So inspired by this, our goal was to still keep the nice properties of RTRL, but make it more scalable. And one way you can do this is you can make the Jacobian, which is this matrix, sparse. And that gives you what we call columnar networks. So the central idea of columnar networks is instead of trying to learn a hidden state, which is a function of all of your parameters, in other words, instead of trying to learn a fully connected recurrent neural network, you can limit the architecture of the recurrent network. So imagine that your hidden state, that you have, your network is composed of different columns, and every column is outputting a scalar hidden state. And the parameters for a hidden state H1 are independent from the parameters of hidden state H2. If your network is organized in this way, then most of your entries in your Jacobian are just 0. And that's because theta 2 here, the green parameter, do not influence, for example, H1. And in fact, if you do all the calculation, you can compute the gradient in real time using number of operations, which is proportional to the number of parameters you have, and you don't have to do any kind of truncation. Now, there is one question that is important to answer here is, because we are limiting the architecture, obviously that means that your recurrent network is not as powerful anymore. And this is something we see empirically when we try to use this limited architecture on recurrent learning benchmarks. The performance you get out at the end is usually not as good as if you had used a fully connected or multi-layer LSTM or something like that. However, that's not too bad in a way. So our justification is that instead of having a fully connected recurrent network, which allows you to learn few things really well, but you can't learn too many things because it doesn't scale nicely, these columnar networks allow you to learn a lot of things in parallel, and your relative error would be high, but that's okay because you don't care about predicting things very precisely. You care about predicting lots and lots of things. In other words, it's important to predict that if you walk forward, you would hit the wall, but maybe it's not that important to know that if you would hit the wall in 3 times step or 4 times steps. And when we use these recurrent networks on problems which are similar to the one that I explained before, in which you're trying to learn a lot of predictions in parallel, we do see that for most of the predictions, this limited architecture is sufficient. So that's where we are right now. And right now, what we're trying to do now is we're trying to show that this kind of architecture, when applied to robots, and can be used to learn millions of predictions in parallel on modern hardware. So that was the main presentation. Let me just summarize the main point. Because we want to achieve goals in large and ever-changing words, it's important to run in real time. And because we want to use very large networks, it's important to learn using algorithms that scale well. Supervision can be scaled by grounding your predictions in your sensory motor stream, because that allows your agent to make predictions and then just interact with the word and get the ground truth and update its prediction. If you learn the right kind of predictions, for instance, discounted sum of a scalar, you can learn it independent of span using very scalable methods. And finally, if you constrain your recurrent architecture, then you can scale recurrent learning to learn thousands of things in parallel as well. So that is all I had planned, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the amazing talk. And thank you very much for being on time. So questions. So are there any questions? So please feel free to unmute if you have questions and to just ask to Khurram.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for this interesting presentation, Khurram, and giving this seminar today. And one question that I have relating the columnar network you shared is, for the function that we have that combines the previous state and the current input, is it the same that we have in the regular recurrent networks, or it doesn't matter and we can use it anyway in this particular network?
So that's a good question. The only constraint here is that every column is outputting a scalar hidden state.
Mm-hmm.
But the function you use for that can be anything. So you can use a small LSTM network with one hidden state, and that would be fine. Or you could use anything else you want.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? So I have Eduardo. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. Sorry. Sorry, all that. Yes, can you elaborate a little bit more, Khurram, if you don't mind, about precisely this trade-off between, how many predictions you can make and the accuracy of the predictions? Because obviously this is, in my understanding, the main, point of your current work. And obviously it is, it's what actually makes a difference with regards to previous, on work in which, everybody's absolutely crazy about accuracy and about, they don't care that much about the number of predictions that per se, but about having predictions that are, accurate. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Right, yeah, for sure. So if you talk about the recurrent learning benchmarks that people or some of the applications for their own language, then I agree with you that accuracy is the most important thing, and everything else is not that important. But when it comes to these robotic tasks or this agent-led construction, in the past, so there is an important problem you have to solve, which is we have to decide what do you want to predict, and there is no real solution to that. But if your algorithm is scalable, then you can essentially just predict everything, or you can predict as many things as you want. And if a prediction is useful, you keep it. And if it's not useful, you throw it away. So in a way, it allows you to search over the prediction space because you don't know what you want to predict. And you can search over them in parallel using a million predictions at a time. And these predictive representations that we want to learn, for them, that part is very important. Yeah. And the accuracy is comparatively less important. But if we could come up with a method that allows us to figure out what to predict, then we can probably use existing methods, and then accuracy would be more important. But the real benefit is that using this, you don't have to solve that hard problem, which is figure out what to predict, because you can just predict everything.
Would this be somehow related to, forgive me if I am just saying something like stupid here, to somehow to the problem of exploration versus exploitation, in the sense that having the ability actually to make a lot of predictions, you could actually understand that as exploiting the environment in parallel, okay, and somehow related to replay, as obviously the David Silver's team have been doing for quite some time.
Sorry, what was the last part?
It's about, I was talking about the replay strategies like David Silver's have been using. So, okay, running, predictions continuously on parallel, basically.
So, again, those methods are pretty nice, I would say, but I'm not exactly sure how mu0 scales, but from what I remember when I read it, it also doesn't scale well. So no, again, if your problem is simple, it's small, you want to use a small function approximator, you have a lot of compute, I think you're good. You can just use the sophisticated algorithm. Okay. But the whole point is that imagine you want to use a function approximator with 100 trillion parameters, and you don't want to use a large data center. And then it becomes, then those strategies just don't work. So like, for example, in our group, we don't even think about them because we know that they just don't work. Because, right?
Okay, no, I follow your point. No, I was not disagreeing. I was trying to clarify that. No, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions?
Yes, Khurram, this is Daniel Prokhorov. Sorry, I don't have camera, but I think you see my picture. You hear?
Yep.
Yes, good. Nice to see Eduardo and a few other friends. So, Khurram, I was thinking that if you make extreme simplifications in the RNN architecture, you potentially deprive your predictions, the accuracy, what basically Eduardo was asking. And that's, I agree, of course, a good trade-off. You rather have a lot more predictions, which kind of so-so, and maybe high prediction error, as opposed to very accurate, but still, you spend a lot more efforts on it. So I would just recommend examine, value of your recurrent connections, because once you start chopping things off or, reduce it to be more and more sparse, we known this for, many years, basically, when we didn't have nearly as powerful computers like 20 some years ago. And we felt that when the recurrent network is more connected, you then have a very interesting behaviors as like what people like Schmidt-Huber and LSTM guys started and claiming that they have all these multi-stable attractors, and we certainly saw their presence. It allow us to simulate very complicated behaviors with very compact architectures. And of course, now trend is basically have much bigger networks, billions and billions connections, but you have no choice but to sparsify. So I would just recommend to look in the value of your recurrent connections if it becomes very sparse network. So
yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I want to emphasize on one thing which I maybe didn't do before. The main constraint we have here is that your recurrence is sparse, but your feed-forward network can be arbitrarily complex. And maybe I should mention some other work which I didn't talk about here is, but essentially what we're thinking is, so I agree with you that you do need these dense form of recurrence to do many interesting things. But in parallel, we have a different algorithms which allows you to use a, how do I say, a feed-forward network with some, okay, let me put it this way. So we have two algorithms. One is this, and the good thing is that you don't need truncation here. And we have a parallel algorithm which you can use to compute the gradients for arbitrary recurrences, but to some degree of truncation. So something similar to truncate backprop. And eventually what we were thinking is to combine both of them, right? So you do need complicated recurrences, but our hypothesis is that maybe if you have the complex recurrence for a few time steps, that's sufficient. And then for longer recurrences, you would have to rely on these very small, sparse recurrence connections. But I completely agree with you that it has to be properly evaluated to see all the trade-offs and to figure out how useful it is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yep. One follow-up question from the last one, Khurram, is from what you say, I assume that for the recent timestamps, the last n, for example, in the context, we can use the full recurrence, and we can combine this model is for the timestamp that are very far away. We can use the column architecture because it somehow relaxes the assumption of the recurrence. So is it possible, or have you considered to combine the both approach where for the recent time step, we use a regular network that has a strong focus on the recurrence dependencies, and the one that is being used for the past events that relaxes this kind of thing in this manner?
So that's a really good question. Right now, what I'm doing is with my colleagues is to explore them independently, but the end goal is to in fact combine them. So right now we are testing how good the other algorithm is, which allows you to have dense recurrences, but for short horizons. And then we're testing this independently, but the end goal is to combine them and then see how well they do.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't done that yet.
Okay, thank you.
So going back to precisely to the base of exploration exploitation, if I may, Khurram, wouldn't actually make sense, so to speak. If I think of exploration, I think precisely what in the sense, in the terms that you are describing here, saying, okay, I don't really care about the accuracy of the predictions because I still don't know anything about it. So all I try to is to focus precisely on having as many predictions as possible. Okay. And now, once we actually, through this exploration process, through having all these kind of predictions, eventually I get to one that I can exploit. Then I actually can move to precisely to the other one and say, look, now what is important is for me to actually form the more accurate one. Okay, I don't care about making a lot of predictions now. I have already gathered enough knowledge to know which ones actually I can exploit. And now on these, I want actually accuracy. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. That makes perfect sense. I think that's a promising strategy. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, so there is additional component that someone else is exploring in this with this idea is that you do need more complicated recurrences, and there are ways to achieve more complicated recurrence, even with this architecture, if you make a few more assumptions. So maybe I can just explain that at a high level. So imagine you're trying to learn millions of predictions, and let's assume that some predictions at least are so simple that you can learn them with this simple architecture.
Mhm.
And you know that you've learned them because your prediction error now is very small on them, right? So now once you have learned a prediction, then all the features and the recurrent state of that prediction can be used by all other predictions as a feature. So
Mhm.
as long as you're willing to assume that there are some easy things you can learn, and once you've learned them, then they allow you to learn more complicated things, then you can make this columnar network more and more dense over time. So it starts off sparse, but then you add more connections, and you can still compute the gradient in a scalable way. The primary issue we have with testing that is because we want to add these dynamic connections and have very large networks, it's pretty hard to do this with our existing frameworks. So we are in parallel, we are doing this implementation in C++ and CUDA, which allows you to add these dynamic connections, but that's going to take a while. But that is one way that at least we are thinking to,
Okay.
over time, make the recurrence more dense and complicated.
Cool.